Greetings from the Tech Cave, Fenris here, and today we're taking a look at the Game Boy Advance. Now, this is the same Game Boy Advance that I picked up while I was vacationing in Japan, and for the price that I paid for it, I was not willing to pass up on it just due to the fact that these tend to be a little bit more expensive when picking them up here in the States. Now, granted, yeah, the shell's all cracked and yellowed, there's some dirt in the speaker grills, it's literally missing a power switch. And yeah, overall, this unit has definitely seen much better days. But one good thing is, if we take a look here, you can see that there's no corrosion on the battery terminals. So that's great. We don't have to worry about any battery damage on the main motherboard. But that aside though, the fact that it doesn't have a power switch and everything else about it, it's not really what you would call in playable shape. So what's one to do? Well, simply put, we're gonna customize it. Now, I had gotten the final pieces for what I'm going to declare as the ultimate Game Boy Advance. At least in my opinion, at least. So, let's not waste any time and get to building. So, first order of business is opening the system up. And as you can see, we have 6 tri-wing screws along the outer part of the shell here, as well as 1 Phillips head screw inside the battery compartment. And there's going to be a couple of other Phillips head screws inside the console itself. So let's get those screws removed and break the Game Boy Advance down to its main components. So as you can see, we have the main motherboard here, and yeah, the buttons certainly do need a bit of cleaning themselves. They're definitely well used. The triggers themselves, they don't feel bad, but they could use a little bit of cleaning themselves as well. But before we get to all that, we're actually going to start with some solder work. So we're going to first recap the board, and as well, I'm going to show you how I go about cleaning the power switches here. So let's not waste any time and start with the power switch. So we're nice and zoomed in on the switch here, and the reason why is I'm going to show you my method of cleaning the switch. Now, the way that most people like to do it is they often put their soldering iron on one of these 2 ground tabs and then lift this metal cage up using a pair of tweezers. I personally don't like doing that, and for a couple reasons. One, you run the risk of accidentally burning off the pads. Number 2, you run the risk of bending this metal piece to the point where the switch will either not move or not make contact with the metal below. And 3, you run the risk of actually breaking the plastic that holds the switch together. So instead of doing that, what we're going to do is we're going to remove all the solder from these 2 ground tabs, and then we're going to just hit it with our hot air rework station in order to rework this off. Now, you do want to be careful because it is made of plastic and you can run the risk of melting it if you apply too much heat in one area. So you want to make sure that you're staying in constant motion in order to remove this switch carefully. So without further delay, let's get to it. So with the switch removed, now we can go ahead and remove the metal caging. So we're just going to take our tweezers here and we're just going to gently lift one corner up and remove it. And as you can see, we did not bend the cage to a point where we would have to try to rebend it into the perfect shape anyways. We're just going to go ahead and remove the switch, and ew. I don't know how well you can see that, but that switch is a bit grody. As you can see, these pens are supposed to be like nice and shiny, and they've certainly lost their luster over the years, which that's not too uncommon with Game Boy Colors or Game Boy Advances these days. Heck, even the Game Boy Advance SP is like this. So how we're gonna take care of this is actually pretty simple. So what most people like to use is they'll use isopropyl, deoxit, and whatnot, and then they'll just go in with a cotton swab and just clean over the contacts. And that's certainly a good way of handling it. That's a very valid way of handling it. But instead, what I'm gonna do is I have here a bottle of iron free that I put in a needle applicator. Now, iron free is like an oxidizing removal agent. This works really well for like rusted parts, and I've used it a lot for corroded contacts, and this thing works wonders. And it was actually thanks to my friend Noctrave who recommended me this product, and this has probably been one of the biggest tools in my repertoire. So what we're gonna do is we're just gonna apply just a little bit of iron free along the contacts here, as well as the switch. And we're just gonna leave that for 5 minutes to work its magic. All right, so 5 minutes have passed, so let's see how this did. So I'm gonna take a Q-tip here, and we're just gonna go ahead and wipe it up. And look at that. That's like a night and day difference. That cleaned up wonderfully. And I bet it's going to do the same for the switch here. Yep, look at that. That is super clean now. But we can't be leaving the iron-free residue on here, so what we're going to do is we're going to splash with a little bit of isopropyl. And let me go grab my toothbrush real quick. All right. And we're just going to brush it up a bit. You don't want any of that iron free to linger because it is a bit of nasty stuff. But like I said, it works wonders. And you might be wondering, like, why do we even need to clean the power switch? Like, say that it works just fine. Do we really need to clean it? Well, aside from the fact that having good electrical contact is necessary for the power switch to work, believe it or not, a lot of times when you experience like noise in your screen mods or audio, a lot of the times it's actually due to a really dirty power switch. So you don't really need like power cleaners and things like that that you see in some Game Boy Advance modding forums where, you know, you take a power cleaner and you solder on some contacts here. Yeah, you don't need any of that. All you really need to do is just make sure that your power switch is really, really clean. And as you can see, our power switch here is really, really clean. So we're just going to go ahead and put this thing back together. If I remember correctly, the pole side goes here. Now you want to be careful not to bend the contact pins. Let's get this back in frame. Gonna put this back on. And there we go. We now have a nice clean power switch to use with our Game Boy Advance. So now the power switch is done. We're going to go ahead and remove the rest of the capacitors here, as well as the speaker here, because this speaker is really crusty. So let's get to it. So now that we got the power switch situation taken care of, we can now move on with the rest of the board. So we're just going to go ahead and remove all these capacitors as well as the speaker, and we're going to prep this board up for a recap. So without further delay, let's get to it. Okay, so as you can see, we got all the old capacitors removed and all the landings cleared up. So all we need to do now is install our cap kit. Now, this is a cap kit I got from Console 5, and fortunately, there's only 4 capacitors that we need to install. So we're going to put the 470 microfarad capacitor into the largest landing here. The larger 100 microfarad capacitor goes into this landing here, and the 2 smaller 100 microfarad capacitors go into these 2 landings here. So you don't have to worry about like mixing up cap types or whatnot. As long as you remember the sizing, you should be good. So let's not waste any time and install the fresh cap kit. Okay, so with our cap kit installed, we can now move ahead with installing our power switch, which there is a little bit of prep work that needs to be done with the power switch itself before we can put it back on the board. So let me go ahead and show you that. Okay, so we're nice and zoomed in on the switch here, and that's because we need to remove all the solder that's on the bottom of these solder contacts. And the reason why for that is because this switch needs to sit as flush with the board as possible. So if we have solder that's already on the bottom of these pads, it could possibly obstruct it and cause some issues in terms of mounting the switch back onto the board. So what we're gonna do is we're just going to apply just a little bit of flux. You don't need a lot. Also apply it on your braid. And we're just gonna come over here. Actually, let me clean my tip. Just gonna come over here and just sweep it with our desoldering wick. Now you want to be careful because, I mean, you can't burn yourself. Actually, let me cut some of this braid off. All right, there we go. We got the solder pads all cleaned up. Now there's only one more thing that we need to do, and that is we need to scrape the back of these pins here, because unfortunately a lot of times the back of this switch tends to be a little oxidized. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a dull X-Acto knife and we're just gonna carefully scrape the backs of these pins. This is so that way we can make sure that the switch makes good contact with the board and it will solder down well. All right, that looks good. So now the switch is ready to be installed back on the board. Okay, so as you can see, we have the motherboard reinstalled into the back half of the Game Boy Advance shell, and as well, we have our screen attached here. And the reason why is, we're going to test to make sure that the motherboard still works. Now, obviously we're not going to get any sound, so we're not going to be able to hear the game working, but we can at least see if the system does boot up. So first order of business is we're going to test Game Boy mode. And the reason why is there is a little switch in the Game Boy Advance's cartridge slot that tells it to switch between either Game Boy or Game Boy Advance mode, depending on whether or not the switch is pulled. So we're going to put in our Game Boy cartridge, flick on the power. Oops, there we go. And as you can see, we are booting into Game Boy mode and we are getting power. So evidently our switch is now more consistent, but let's see if we can, yep, we can stretch and shrink the screen just by hitting the L and R buttons. So our L and Rs are still good. Power that off. Now we're going to put in a Game Boy Advance game just to make sure that it can boot into Game Boy Advance mode. And as you can see, we are booting into Game Boy Advance mode. So yeah, looks like our motherboard is still good. So now that we've gotten that taken care of, we're just going to go ahead and remove the motherboard from the shelf here and get it ready for some mods. So the first modification that we're going to tackle with this Game Boy Advance is this. Now this is a little audio amp that is being sold by Retro Game Repair Shop, and it's marketed to work for both the Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance. Now unfortunately I could not find a suitable diagram as to how to install this into a Game Boy Advance. So what I did is I created my own diagram based off of the install pictures that RGRS provided. So we're just going to go ahead and mount it in this area and wire it into place. So without further delay, let's get to it. So first order of business is we're going to be attaching our wiring. So I'm going to be using 3 different colored 30 AUG wiring here. And the only signals that we need to tap from the main motherboard are the ground, which we're going to tap from this capacitor here, 5 volts, which we're going to tap from the top pad of R26 here, and as well as our audio input, which we're going to grab from the top pad of the speaker here. So let's not waste any time and get to it. Okay, with all our wires installed, all we need to do now is attach them to the audio amp. So the way that we're going to do this is, since all of the pads are actually labeled on the underneath of the board, we're just going to take our wires, and since we used a 30 AUG wire, these should feed right through. Let's see, this is our audio input, but as you can see, they feed right through the holes. So we're going to also grab our audio ground, and yeah, as you can tell, I had the wires bent a specific way on purpose, so that way everything just loops right through, and it offers the shortest wire path as well. So we're just going to keep pulling on the wires, trying not to break anything. And if we do this correctly, we can basically have the board sit flush without the need of any hot glue. It's a little crooked. Let's see if I can pull that up a little bit. There we go. Good enough for government work. So let's go ahead and clip these wires, strip the sleeving, and solder them in. All right, so we have our audio amp installed, and just to verify its fitment, what we're going to do is we're going to put it back into its original shell and see if it clears. And you can kind of barely see it, but it will clear the back shell, so all good. So now that we've verified that the install is all good for the audio amp, we can now move forward to the screen mod. Okay, so what I have in this little envelope here is my laminated screen mod that I'm going to be using with this Game Boy Advance. And more often than not, I have been asked before as to which screen mod I personally prefer when doing GBA installs. And simply put, I like to use... Here we are. Actually, let's get the... Looks like it comes with a bracket. All right, here it is. So this laminated screen uses a DSi screen. And the reason why I prefer this screen in particular is because the DSi has a perfect resolution match to the original Game Boy Advance. As well, I feel that DSi screens, as well as like even the AGS 101 screen, doesn't exhibit some of the visual quirks that IPS panels typically have. Usually it comes in the form of like motion blur, or even like, what is it, like drop shadows being kind of disappearing or getting interlace artifacts or something like that, if I remember correctly. But either way, the DSi top screen just does not exhibit any of those behaviors. And in fact, looks just as good as using an IPS screen, in my opinion anyways. So this is the screen that we're going to be using, and we're going to be using it with this shell. Now, my favorite Pokemon of all time is Haunter. So when I saw this box along with this shell, I just knew I had to make this build. And as you can see, that is a really cool looking shell. And this is going to plop in perfectly. So we're going to go ahead and build our Haunter Game Boy Advance with this screen. So let's get to it. Okay, so the first order of business is we need to test our screen to make sure that everything is good to go. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to attach our screen to the included driver board, and then we're going to be using one of these two ribbons to attach to our Game Boy Advance. Now, which ribbon you're going to be using is dependent on how many pins your original screen had. So as you can see on my Game Boy Advance, as it says on the silk screen here, my original screen had 40 pins. So we're going to be using the 40 pin ribbon. And to confirm it, you can see that on the ribbon itself, it says IFA 40. So this is the correct ribbon. Now, if ours used a 32 pin screen, we would use the ribbon that says IFA 32. So we're going to get all this attached to the Game Boy Advance, and then we're going to power the Game Boy Advance to make sure our screen works. All right, with everything hooked up, let's flick on the power to make sure everything is good. So let's just do that. And as we can see, the screen does turn on. So it looks like everything checks out in terms of the screen working. So we're just gonna cut the power, and we're going to carefully remove this Game Boy Advance out of the back shell here, get this ribbon disconnected, and put it all together in the shell. Actually, before we go ahead and reassemble the system, I just realized that I forgot to actually clean the button contacts here. So what we're going to be using in order to do that is this. This is a sand and pencil eraser, and I like to use the something like this when it comes to contact cleaning. Now, for mild corrosion, I like to just use the pencil part, which is just a regular eraser. But for more major corrosion, like what we have here on the right point here, I like to use the sand eraser in order to really buff it out. So we're just going to go ahead and erase the contacts to really make them shine again. And we can already see a major improvement with the right pad. And yeah, now we're just going to go over the rest of them with the pencil eraser. After I'm done with the pencil eraser, I just like to go over it just once more with a cotton swab and some isopropyl, just to make sure that everything is nice and shiny. Okay, so one more little bit of prep work before we move on to assembly. We need to attach some wires to our ribbon cable of choice here. Now, as you can see, we have pads labeled R, L, and S. The reason why is these are going to be our right shoulder button, left shoulder button, and select button. This is so that way we can control the brightness of the screen, and I think some of these kits have an on-screen display. I'm not sure if this kit in particular does, but we're going to attach these wires so that way we can at least control the brightness of our screen. So let's not waste any time and get to it. Alright, so last bit of soldering that needs to be done. We just need to attach these 3 conductor wires to the main board. So our select wire is going to be attached to test point 2. Our left shoulder button wire is going to attach to test point 9. And our right shoulder button wire is going to attach to test point 8. So let's not waste any time and get those attached. Okay, so with all the wires attached, we can now move on to final reassembly. Okay, so remember when I said we were done with the soldering iron? Well, it turns out I lied because I actually forgot about the speaker amp. So let's connect our speaker to the amp. Alright, there's just one more ingredient left for this Game Boy Advance build, and that is a nice rechargeable battery from Funny Playing. So in order to install this into our system, all we need to do is just remove these battery terminals here. Take our module and just slip it in, making sure the wires are pushed out and the PCB sits flush like so. Just tuck in some of this excess. And clip on our battery. Attach our included heatsink right here. And finally, take our custom molded battery plate and just clip it on. Beautiful. So I'm going to plug this in to let it charge, and then we'll do some final testing. All right, so I've let this thing charge for about an hour, so let's see if it still works. So let's flick on the power just to see if the system still boots. And as you can see in here, it does. So if we hold the select button, as you can see here, we're able to get into an on-screen display now. So we can switch between like the different settings. We can adjust the brightness. I like to keep it around 5 just to keep it, you know, balanced, if you will. This option, I'm not sure exactly what this does. So I'm probably just going to leave it alone. While XST and YST, on the other hand, these two options adjust the screen positioning. In case your screen's like slightly to like the left or right or up and down, you can make adjustments to that. So we don't really need to do that. So yeah. We're able to boot into the Game Boy Advance, but now we need to see if it plays games. So let's start with a Game Boy game. As we can see, we're able to boot into Game Boy mode. Next, let's test Game Boy Advance. And it's looking good so far. And we're able to boot into Game Boy Advance mode. So yeah, looks like our unit does work. So yeah, we took a Game Boy Advance that looked yellowed and disheveled and made it into a true work of art. So yeah, that's really it. If you liked what you saw, feel free to like, comment, subscribe. And as always, until the blue moon rises, I'll see you next time.